The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the young black man walked through its grand wooden doors. His suit was plain, his shoes slightly worn his hands, trembling not from fear but from years of restraint. The judge leaned back with a faint smirk, tapping his gavel lazily, already convinced of what he thought he saw. Another defendant who didn't belong here, another case to dismiss without thought. Cameras clicked, jurors exchanged glances, and the air thickened with the silent weight of judgment. But what no one knew, what no one expected, was that this man wasn't the accused. He was about to challenge the very system that had written him off since birth. As he placed his worn briefcase on the table, the courtroom's laughter echoed like distant thunder, mocking his presence. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You're representing yourself?" A pause, then a quiet confidence in his tone. "No, Your Honor. I'm representing justice." In that single moment, everything shifted. What began as another day of mockery was about to unravel into a battle of intellect, integrity, and truth. And by the time the final gavel struck, the same courtroom that ridiculed him would rise to its feet in stunned silence. As the murmurs settled, the man adjusted his tie and looked around the courtroom, a sea of skeptical faces, reflecting centuries of inherited bias. To them, he was out of place, a glitch in the pattern. His name was Darius Cole, a name the system had learned to ignore. For years, his life had been a story of quiet endurance, from the cracked sidewalks of his childhood neighborhood to the ivy-covered walls of a law school that never wanted him there. Darius had grown up in Southbridge, a forgotten part of the city, where sirens replaced lullabies and opportunity was a rumor people whispered about. His mother, Lorraine, cleaned office buildings by day and prayed by night, her hands calloused from scrubbing floors no one else wanted to touch. His father, once a promising mechanic, had been arrested for a crime he didn't commit, a routine stop gone wrong, a life rewritten in seconds. Darius was only 13 then, but that moment became the ignition point of everything that followed. He remembered standing in that courtroom years ago, watching his father being silenced by lawyers who spoke over him, a judge who barely looked at him, and a system that decided guilt before evidence. Darius swore that day he would return not as another victim, but as someone who understood the rules well enough to rewrite them. Yet, even with his degree and credentials, every door he knocked on shut before it could open. Firms that smiled on the phone stiffened when he arrived in person. Partners praised his eloquence, but never hired him. His resume was flawless, his skin color was the problem. So he created his own path, helping people in neighborhoods like Southbridge navigate a legal maze designed to confuse them. Today was supposed to be another small case, a young mother, wrongfully accused of shoplifting. But when Darius discovered that the prosecutor handling it was the same one who'd built his father's case years ago, he saw more than a trial. He saw a reckoning. The judge, Harold Whitman, was infamous for his condescension, a man who carried his privilege like a robe, heavier than his title. He had seen Darius's name on the docket that morning and smirked, remembering it from a complaint Darius once filed against him for discriminatory remarks. It had been dismissed, of course. The system protects its own. Now here they were, face to face again. Darius versus Whitman, not as a boy against a gavel, but as a man armed with knowledge and resolve. He scanned the courtroom, the jury a mosaic of indifference, the opposing counsel confident and smug, his client trembling in the corner, clutching her child's, drawing like a shield. Every element reminded him of why he was here. This wasn't just about proving innocence. It was about exposing how justice looked different, depending on who stood before it. When the clerk called the case, the room fell into expectant silence. Whitman cleared his throat and began with the same rehearsed tone he had used 1,000 times before, one that dripped with authority but lacked empathy. Darius listened, unflinching, letting the weight of every word fuel him. Outside the courthouse, the city moved on cars, honking vendors, shouting people, hurrying to lives untouched by what was unfolding inside. But for Darius, time had slowed. Every second here carried the weight of generations. Before him, of voices silenced and dreams deferred. He was not just representing his client. He was representing every person who had ever been told they didn't belong in rooms like this. As the opening statements began, Whitman leaned forward, almost amused. "Proceed, Mr. Cole." He said the words laced with mockery. Darius stepped closer to the podium, his voice steady yet charged with emotion. He looked directly at the judge, not in defiance, but in quiet assertion. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not merely a case of theft. It's a case of perception, of how quickly we assume guilt when we see a face that challenges our comfort. Today I intend to prove not only that my client is innocent, but that the assumptions guiding this courtroom are not." A ripple moved through the audience. The judge's smirk faltered slightly, his fingers tightening on the gavel. Somewhere deep within, he sensed that this would not be an ordinary proceeding, and for Darius, it was only the beginning. The courtroom lights hummed faintly as the air grew, dense with quiet anticipation. Darius stood still, letting the silence stretch, just long enough to command attention. Every eye was on him now, the underdog, the man who didn't belong standing in the very place designed to exclude him. He began methodically, his voice calm and precise. "My client, Ms. Renee Porter, entered that grocery store to buy milk for her son. The prosecution claims she concealed an item in her purse. But what the cameras don't show," he said, pausing as he slid a printed image across the table, "is that the store's security guard stopped her before she even reached the checkout." The prosecutor leaned back, unimpressed. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant." Whitman waved his hand, indulging him. "Proceed, but make it quick," he muttered. Darius didn't flinch. "Of course," he replied, his tone respectful yet firm. He knew this game. Every word he spoke would be scrutinized, twisted, and diminished. But he also knew how to make truth louder than prejudice. He presented the footage. Next, grainy, muted, yet powerful. It showed Renee calmly walking, holding a small carton of milk, stopping at a shelf and speaking to her child. The security guard approached, abruptly grabbing her arm. Before she could respond, few jurors leaned forward. Darius caught the shift, subtle but real. Seeds of doubt. "This," Darius continued, "is what we often forget, that perception can convict faster than evidence. The assumption of guilt follows people like my client everywhere they go. Even a simple grocery run becomes a crime scene when you look the wrong way." The judge's face remained unreadable, but his fingers drummed faster against the desk. Then came the moment Darius had prepared for, the revelation buried in the evidence files the prosecution had overlooked, or perhaps ignored. A store employee's statement redacted from the initial report revealed that another woman of a different race had committed a similar act that same week and had simply been let go with a warning. Darius placed the document on the evidence table. "Justice," he said softly, "should not be selective." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor objected, his tone sharpened by discomfort. "Your Honor, this is inflammatory." Whitman hesitated, a rare moment of visible uncertainty. He could sustain the objection in silence. Darius, or overrule and expose the imbalance. His pride wrestled with his conscience, overruled. He finally muttered, his voice quieter than before. Darius continued, "Steady as a tide, for years, people like my client have been treated as guilty until proven innocent, and sometimes even after innocence is proven, they're never truly free. But today the truth will not be buried in footnotes." Each piece of evidence he presented added another crack to the courtroom's facade. The jury began to listen, not out of courtesy but conviction. The audience, once skeptical, grew silent. Even the bailiff, arms crossed near the back, softened his stance. As Darius spoke, fragments of his past replayed in his mind, his father's voice, trembling with anger and confusion, his mother's tears after visiting hours, the way people averted their eyes when the verdict came down. Every sentence he uttered now felt like a line written by all those who had never been heard. But beneath his calm exterior, the pressure built. He knew Whitman's temper. He knew how this courtroom could turn on him in an instant, and just as expected, it did. Mr. Cole, Whitman interrupted, his tone cutting through the air. "This court will not be used as a platform for social commentary. Stick to the facts." Darius looked up slowly, with respect. "Your Honor, these are the facts. Bias isn't abstract, it's measurable. It's documented. It's here in every unequal sentence and every overlooked piece of truth." The tension snapped. The judge's gavel struck the desk, echoing like thunder. "Enough!" The audience gasped. For a brief moment, time froze. Darius stood firm, his expression Calm, yet his eyes spoke volumes defiance. Tempered by dignity, then something unexpected happened. One of the jurors, an older white woman, raised her hand. Hesitantly, "Your Honor," she said. "Softly, may we review the footage again?" The courtroom turned toward her, startled. Whitman's jaw tightened, but he couldn't. "Refuse." "Granted," he said, reluctantly, The footage replayed, the silence was deafening. This time, everyone noticed what Darius had seen all along: the guard's aggression. The fear in Renee's eyes, the absence of theft. It was no longer about evidence. It was about humanity. When the lights came back on, Darius exhaled quietly. He knew this wasn't over. The hardest part was yet to come, confronting the very man who had once condemned his father, the prosecutor sitting across from him. That night, back in his small apartment, Darius reviewed every document, every case note, every precedent. His walls were lined with newspaper clippings, names of men and women exonerated after years of false imprisonment. At the center, pinned beneath a broken clock, was his father's faded mugshot. The eyes in the photo stared back at him, both proud and haunted. This time, Darius whispered, "To himself, they'll hear us." The next morning, as he entered the courthouse again, the air felt different. Reporters lingered outside, now sensing a story beyond the usual routine. Inside, Whitman avoided eye contact while the prosecutor, unsettled by the shifting tide, whispered urgently to his assistant. When proceedings resumed, Darius brought forth a new witness, a former store employee who had resigned weeks after the incident. Her statement, trembling yet honest, revealed a pattern of racial profiling encouraged by the store's management. Every word struck like a hammer. The courtroom, once dismissive, was now rapt. Even Whitman's smirk had dissolved completely. By the end of the session, it was no longer a question of whether Renee was innocent. It was a question of how far the truth would go and how much power those in control were willing to lose to protect their image. As Darius gathered his notes, he could feel the storm gathering. The prosecution's next move would be vicious, and Judge Whitman, cornered between pride and morality, would not go down quietly. The battle for justice had truly begun, and this time it wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the conscience of everyone watching. The air inside the courtroom felt heavier the next morning. The temperature hadn't changed, but something else had: the unspoken awareness that Darius Cole was no longer just a participant in this trial. He had become the pulse of it. The tension hummed like electricity. Every seat was filled, every whisper muffled by curiosity and fear. The prosecutor, Samuel Trent, walked in first, his confidence thinner than before. Gone was the arrogance of day one. He avoided Darius's gaze, clutching his papers like armor. Behind him, Judge Whitman entered, his expression a mask of authority, struggling to conceal irritation, the kind that comes when power feels its grip slipping. The bailiff called the court to order. Darius stood. His calmness was deliberate, his silence powerful. He knew Whitman was waiting for him to slip, to lose composure, to confirm the prejudice that had shadowed him all his life. But Darius had learned long ago that silence could roar, louder than words. The prosecution began its rebuttal, arguing technicalities, twisting, phrasing, dancing around evidence. But each sentence only deepened their own contradiction. When they accused the witness of bias, Darius quietly handed over another affidavit, one signed by multiple employees, corroborating her story. When they claimed the footage was unclear, Darius produced the original timestamp, proving it had been deliberately cropped. It wasn't just a defense anymore. It was exposure. Then came the moment that would define everything. "Mr. Cole," the judge said, breaking the tense rhythm, "I see you have more documents you wish to submit. I assume they're relevant?" Darius met his gaze evenly. "Yes." "Your Honor, extremely." He stepped forward and handed the clerk a sealed folder. Inside was a copy of an archived case file, his father's. The courtroom stilled. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. "This, Darius," began, his voice low but resonant, "is the case of Cole versus State of New Haven, 1999, prosecuted by none other than Mr. Samuel Trent." The prosecutor froze. Whitman's eyes widened slightly. The name alone carried a weight neither had expected to face. "Today, my father," Darius continued, "was convicted of auto theft based on false testimony. Evidence later proved The car had never been stolen. At all, it was impounded due to clerical error. But the truth came too late. He died behind bars. The words struck like a hammer. A quiet gasp rippled through the crowd. "I bring this not for sympathy," Darius said, but for context. The same man who destroyed my father's life now seeks to destroy another innocent person's. The same system that ignored one truth tries to silence another. Whitman's jaw tightened. "Mr. Cole, this is highly irregular. With respect—" "Your Honor," Darius interrupted, his tone unwavering. "What's irregular is the pattern. How easily justice bends for some and breaks for others." Whitman's gavel hit the desk. "Control yourself." Darius didn't move. "I am in control. For the first time, this courtroom will hear what it has long refused." For a long moment, no one spoke. Whitman's authority felt suddenly fragile, brittle, under the weight of what Darius had unleashed. The prosecutor tried to recover, sputtering about relevance and emotional manipulation. But Darius was ready. "If justice is emotionless, then humanity has no place here," he said, "and yet it's humanity that this court claims to defend." He turned to the jury, his voice softer now, carrying the gravity of something deeply personal. "You've seen the evidence. You've seen how truth was buried under assumption. Ask yourselves, if it weren't for a man who looks like me, would this case have ever reached this far, or would it have ended before it began?" A hush fell over the room. No one dared look away. Then Darius reached into his briefcase and pulled out one final document, a recommendation letter, not for his client but for himself, signed by one of the most respected judges in the state, commending his unmatched intellect and legal integrity. He placed it on the table gently. "I didn't come here to prove my worth," he said. "I came to remind you that worth doesn't need permission to exist." Whitman's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. For the first time, his own reflection in it seemed foreign. A man who prided himself on fairness now, realizing how deeply unfair he had been. The jury deliberated in silence. Minutes felt like hours. Darius sat motionless, eyes closed, hands folded, the weight of generations pressing down, yet holding him steady. Finally, the four persons stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." A collective exhale swept the room. Renee burst into tears, her child clutching her leg. Reporters scrambled, flashes bursting like fireworks. Darius remained still for a moment, absorbing the quiet chaos. Then he rose, turning toward Judge Whitman. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. Judge and man, privilege and perseverance, prejudice and truth. The silence between them said more than words ever could. Whitman looked down, the gavel heavy in his grasp. For once, he didn't speak. Darius turned and walked out of the courtroom, each step echoing like punctuation to a story, centuries in the making. Outside, the crowd erupted. But he didn't smile. Not yet. Justice had been served in one case, but he knew deep down the real trial was far from over, because justice in his world was never permanent. It was something you had to keep defending every single day. The courthouse steps were flooded with flashing lights, microphones, and hurried questions. But Darius Cole moved through them like a man walking underwater. Slow, deliberate, distant. Reporters shouted his name, asking how it felt to win, how it felt to prove a judge wrong, how it felt to make history. But history wasn't what he'd come for. He hadn't fought for headlines. He'd fought for something quieter, something deeper, dignity. Renee stood beside him, her child clinging to her coat, eyes bright with tears of gratitude. "You saved us," she whispered. Darius looked down, offering the faintest of smiles. "No," he said softly, "you saved yourself. I just helped them see it." Behind them, Judge Whitman exited through a side door. His steps were slower than usual, his robe feeling heavier than ever. For the first time in his long career, the weight of his own decisions pressed harder than the law itself. He paused by the courthouse column, watching Darius from a distance. The man he had mocked had just reminded him of what justice truly meant. That night, as the city's glow reflected off the rain-slicked streets, Darius sat alone in his apartment, staring at his father's mugshot, the one pinned beneath the broken clock. The clock had stopped at 3:47, the exact hour his father had been sentenced. For years, Darius had refused to fix it. It served as a reminder that time, for some people, never moved forward until justice caught up. He took the photo down gently, wiped away the thin layer of dust, and whispered, "We did it. Dad, not all of it. But we started. Across town." Judge Whitman sat in his office, the courtroom now silent and dark. He replayed the day's trial in his mind, not the arguments or the verdict, but the moments in between, the way Darius had spoken, the courage in his tone, the composure he maintained even as the system tried to break him. Whitman thought of every man and woman he had dismissed over the years. Every time he'd mistaken confidence for arrogance. Every time he'd assumed guilt before proof. He opened his drawer and pulled out an old law textbook. On the first page was an inscription from his mentor. "Justice must be blind, but never heartless." He read the line over and over, feeling its truth burn through years of arrogance. For the first time, Judge Harold Whitman felt something close to shame, not for what he'd done today, but for what he'd ignored for decades. The next morning, newspapers across the city blared headlines. "Unknown attorney exposes systemic bias in landmark case." "Judge faces backlash for courtroom conduct." "Truth on trial, how one man redefined justice." But Darius didn't read them. He was already back in Southbridge, walking through the same cracked sidewalks where his story began. Children played basketball in the streets. Women hung laundry across porches, and the world carried on. Unaware that something had quietly shifted, he stopped in front of a small community center, its windows fogged, its paint chipped. Inside, a group of teens sat in a circle, studying for their mock trial competition. When they saw him, their faces lit up. One of them, a boy no older than 16, asked, "Mr. Cole, did you really stand up to a judge?" Darius smiled. "I didn't stand up to him," he said. "I stood up for what's right. There's a difference." They listened, wide-eyed, as he spoke, not about laws or tactics, but about courage, about knowing when silence becomes complicity, about how power yields nothing unless someone demands it. His words carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. When he left the center, the sun was setting behind the skyline, gold bleeding into gray. For the first time in years, he felt peace, not victory but purpose. He knew there would be more battles ahead, more courts, more judges like Whitman. But he also knew something had changed. The echoes of his father's trial no longer haunted him. They guided him. Later that evening, a letter arrived at his office. It bore no return address, only a wax seal embossed with the insignia of the state court. Inside, a single handwritten note read, "Mr. Cole, I watched you today. You reminded me of what this robe once meant. I may never undo the past, but I can start by seeing differently. A.W." Darius folded the letter quietly, setting it beside his father's photo. He didn't need an apology. He needed awareness, and that was enough. As he looked out the window at the city lights flickering like scattered hopes, a thought formed in his mind, one he would carry forever. Justice isn't about who wins. It's about who refuses to stop. Fighting when losing becomes routine. He picked up his briefcase, turned off the lights, and stepped into the night. Rain began to fall again, soft and rhythmic, washing the streets clean, for now. Somewhere, a judge reflected. Somewhere, a mother slept free. Somewhere, a child dreamed that maybe someday, courtrooms wouldn't be battlefields but places of truth. And in that fragile, fleeting hope, justice, for once, felt real. In a world where perception often outweighs proof, Darius Cole became a reminder that silence is not peace, and justice is not justice until it serves everyone equally.